All right, let's dive into a new deep dive, shall we? Imagine it's 1979, you're on the Gulf Coast, just living your life when the news starts buzzing about this hurricane. But not just any hurricane. No, this one's different. We're talking massive, powerful, the kind of storm that sends 500,000 people running for higher ground. That, my friends, was Hurricane Frederic, and that's what we're digging into today.
And we've got a treasure trove of material to uncover, from the National Weather Service's official records to some really vivid first-hand accounts I found in this owl.com article. Fascinating stuff.
Speaking of fascinating, I gotta say, right out the gate, this story from the owl.com piece about that person near Pensacola getting swept away from their boat during the storm, it just hits hard, you know? Really puts a human face on this force of nature we're talking about.
Absolutely. It's a stark reminder that behind all the statistics, the wind speeds, the damage reports, there are real people whose lives are forever changed by these events. And Frederic definitely left its mark, both in terms of its sheer power and, unfortunately, the losses that came with it.
No doubt about that. So let's dive into the storm itself, shall we? What made Frederic so extraordinary, even among other hurricanes?
Well, Frederic was a record breaker, no doubt about it. But what really set it apart was its size. I mean, picture this. A hurricane with an eye 50 miles wide.
50 miles. That's bigger than some countries, I swear.
Right. It's just mind-boggling. It was the largest hurricane eye ever recorded at that time, and it really shook even the seasoned meteorologists. They were blown away.
I bet. Did they even have the technology back then to fully grasp a storm of that magnitude?
Well, it was the early days of satellite imagery, so they could see it, but actually wrapping their heads around a storm of that scale, that was another thing entirely. And then you've got the human element, too. Imagine over 500,000 people fleeing their homes, the biggest evacuation the Gulf Coast had ever seen. The roads must have been absolutely gridlocked.
Can't even imagine. It boggles the mind. And then this monster storm slams into Dauphin Island on September 12th. What category hurricane are we talking about here?
So Frederic officially hit as a Category 3, but here's where it gets interesting. Some analyses suggest it could have actually been a Category 4 based on how they classified hurricanes back then.
A potential Category 4. Wow. All right, so we're dealing with a seriously powerful hurricane here. What kind of damage are we talking about when Frederic finally makes landfall?
Picture this. A wall of water, taller than a basketball hoop, slamming onto the shore. That's what those coastal communities were up against. We're talking a storm surge of 12 to 15 feet high.
Oh, man, that's just unimaginable. No wonder the damage was so severe.
Yeah, the owl.com article paints a pretty vivid picture of the devastation, especially in Mobile. They said something like almost 90% of the city was blacked out. Even their city hall, that iconic building, even that was battered by the winds. And it wasn't just the immediate hit. Imagine trying to put your life back together in that heat and humidity with no power for weeks.
Weeks? Oh, man, I started to get twitchy after a couple hours without Wi-Fi. Power outages, the structural damage, anything else, any other, lasting images that people still talk about?
One of the most striking images from Frederic is all those pine trees permanently leaning to the northwest, just bent completely out of shape by the sheer force of that hurricane.
Wow, that's wild. It's like a scar on the landscape, a reminder of nature's power long after the storm's gone. And speaking of, we mentioned the financial toll earlier, but those numbers are worth repeating. $2.3 billion in damage. That's astronomical, even today.
Absolutely. And that's in $1979. Adjusted for inflation, we'd be talking about a significantly higher figure today. It really puts things into perspective, right? The lasting economic impact these storms can have, it's incredible.
Yeah, the ripple effects are crazy. But here's something I found interesting, maybe even a little unexpected. You mentioned that Frederic, as destructive as it was, actually kind of kickstarted this wave of redevelopment along the Gulf Coast. How did that happen?
It is a bit of a strange twist, isn't it? Take Gulf Shores, Alabama, for instance. Before Frederic hit, it was a much quieter, less developed stretch of coastline. But then, after the storm wiped out a lot of the existing infrastructure, there was this boom in condo construction. It was almost like a chance to start fresh.
So Frederic kind of inadvertently reshaped the landscape in a very literal sense.
Exactly. It's a complicated legacy, right? You've got the devastation, the loss, but then on the other hand, this period of rebuilding and reimagining what the Gulf Coast could be.
It makes you wonder, did all that rebuilding, did it lead to any positive changes, like tougher building codes, better disaster preparedness, things like that, because of Frederic?
That's a really important point, and it gets to the heart of Frederic's legacy. It's tough to pin down specific changes to any one event, But Frederic definitely forced those communities to take a hard look at their infrastructure. How prepared were they, really? And with more and more people moving to the coast, well, it was clear something had to change.
So Frederick was kind of a wake-up call for the Gulf Coast.
Yeah, exactly. It highlighted the need for stricter building codes, especially in those vulnerable coastal areas. And from a planning perspective, it got people thinking about responsible development. How can we rebuild but do it in a way that takes the long-term impact of hurricanes into account?
It's incredible how a single event can have such a ripple effect. I mean, shaping the Gulf Coast even today, decades later.
Makes you wonder, right? If a storm like Frederic hit today, with so much more development along the coast, what would the impact be? Something to think about.
No doubt about it. All right, so as we wrap up our deep dive into Hurricane Frederic, what's the biggest takeaway for our listeners, especially now, right in the middle of hurricane season?
I think Frederick drives home the point that hurricanes aren't just things of the past. They're a reality for folks living in hurricane-prone areas. The key is preparedness. It's not enough to know a hurricane might hit. We gotta have a plan, an emergency kit, and we have to stay informed about potential threats.
Preparedness is key, absolutely.
Mhm.
It's easy to become complacent, especially if you haven't lived through a major storm yourself.
Exactly, and that's why these stories like Frederick are so important. They remind us of just how powerful nature can be. We have to respect that power and, most importantly, be ready for whatever comes our way.
Well said. So, as we close out our deep dive into Hurricane Frederic, let's leave our listeners with this thought. Imagine yourself back on the Gulf Coast just after Frederic hit. What lessons would you carry with you? Not just about the storm itself, but about how we live with nature, how we prepare for the unexpected. Think about it. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, keep diving deep.